Mr. Helal, do you see Egypt as waiting for a multilateral talks to resume, or is the country just kind of pressing ahead with bilateral deals? How do your priorities stack up at the moment?
I think as my colleague said, the train has stalled, and you cannot afford to wait. Egypt is in fact a signatory to a number of bilateral trade agreements. COMESA, the Agadir, the COESA. I mean, we have 5 or 6 trade agreements that add to the advantages of Egypt. And the thing about those trade agreements is they do give the signatory country an advantage. Let's take the COMESA, for example. Egypt has a very unique geographical situation. With the COMESA, it is now being viewed and certainly being promoted by us as a gateway to Africa, because you can come in, set up your manufacturing facility in Egypt, and use the trade agreement to go into other markets, paying favorable rates on taxes and tariffs and so on. Chinese investors have done that. Turkish investors have done that. Now, the thing I would like to add, however, it doesn't matter how many trade agreements you enter into. The point is, are you competitive? Are you producing the quality that is needed? This is something which, again, we still have a lot to learn about. Just to give you an example, I recall a meeting I had with one of our former investment ministers with the Chinese counterparts. The trade volume between Egypt and China is about $9 billion. 8 billion of imports from China and 1 billion exports from Egypt. And the minister asked a rather naive question. He basically was pointing out to this imbalance and was sort of delusionally inviting the Chinese government to redress that balance and saying basically, we want you to import more. Now, I found that a bit amusing because I'm sure the Chinese would love to import more. They do import quite a bit. They're one of the largest importers in the world anyway. But the point that was missed is any country, Egypt is no exception, needs to assess what is it that they're good at, which product, which service they have a competitive edge in, and really concentrate on that. And once we can do that, then the world is open. It's an open market. As my colleague said, companies and governments are looking for the best product and the best service, best in terms of pricing, but equally important in terms of quality. So it really has to go down to the point of competitiveness. This world is not only interconnected, I would actually take it a step further and say it's interdependent. And the only way to survive in an open global economy as we are today is that you need to be competitive, which means focus on what you're good at, and the rest will follow.
I want to move the discussion a bit from free trade towards the second part of our title, which is fair trade. Mr. Safadi, I wonder if I could start with you. Does the movement from multilateral frameworks for trade agreements towards these bilateral deals make it harder to enforce norms on issues like workers' rights and environmental protections? Is it harder to assure that those concerns will be built into trade deals? And do you see this as a problem going forward?
Well, unfortunately, so far the idea of a fair trade in a multilateral context has been more about punishment and reward, which means that, like countries can penalize their trading partners in cases those partners do not abide by certain labor rules, environmental rules. So we're still missing the positive agenda, the carrot. It's all about a stick. So a stick, for example, if you listen to the discussions surrounding the border trade adjustment or border tax adjustment, excuse me, which meant that, okay, if in your own country you produce a good or a service without due regard to certain environmental or labor rights as defined by the importing country, then I'm going to countervail those at the border through what is called a border tax adjustment. That kind of a discussion doesn't bode well for a deal. For every stick, you need a carrot. So where's the carrot? Is the carrot a transfer from country A to country B, a developed country to a developing country, trying to actually make the developing country, the said developing country, change its behavior in the sense that it implements environmental and labor rights that may or may not be good for that country, but for the importing country, it says you have to do this. So we have a lot of grounds to cover before we can actually get into, first, the problem definition. Look at the environmental debate. Look at what happened in Copenhagen, Rio +20, all these discussions. At the end of the day, they're pitting you have two parties to the debate. One party is saying, you got to do this. The other party is saying, no, why do I have to do it to change the way I've been doing business? Especially since it was you in the first place that got us into this situation in terms of the environmental well-being or ill-being, for that matter. So there is an equity issue here, and there is an issue at the end of the day to say, well, okay, suppose that it was the Industrial Revolution, what happened later in Europe and the United States that actually created that ozone, that hole in the ozone, and what have you. So how can we deal with it now? Because now we live in a global village. It's what we call the global commons. And therefore, there is no escape from cooperative solutions. There is no way that we can actually, till today, try to shove someone's agenda down someone else's throat and say, here's the deal, here's how you need to solve the issue. So unilateral measures do not get us into what we're seeking. Because what happens, in China on the environment actually affects what happens to the environment in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So no matter what preventive measures in Europe we take or in the States we take, unless China, India, and others join an agreement, join the targets, agree to the targets, agree to the objectives, then we will not be able to achieve those targets. Let's face it. And therefore, it is about mostly diplomacy than a stick. So you countervail, we do a border tax adjustment, we stop imports, we do all this. These are punitive measures that will only serve to do a tit-for-tat policy and will never, ever get us to the promised land here of multilateral cooperation.
Mr. Zhong, I'm sure it's not a huge surprise to you that some people view China's expansion into Africa, at least in the United States and in the West, with a bit of suspicion, and accuse China of sometimes making these deals in a purely kind of realpolitik fashion, where it's just furthering its own geopolitical interests. Do issues like, how does China address issues like workers' rights and environmental concerns in the trade deals that it makes? Are these discussions that you have when you work with other African countries? And how accurate is the perception that a lot of us have in the West of the way China approaches Africa and the developing world?
I know some people in Europe or in North America, when they talk about Chinese role in Africa, bring them some kind of upset feelings. Because even I myself been confronted from time to time by people asking why you are in Africa. But the questioners themselves are not Europe, not African themselves. Seems to me some people still regard Africa as their backyards. Africa belongs to them. So you come to a place which they came earlier and claim that to be their own territory, so they think China is an intruder. But we see things differently. We think Africa is our brother, or brother and sister. We fought against imperialism colonialism side by side in the 1960s, 1970s, as early as 1950s. And it's quite a natural result that we come together. They come to us, we come to them, not only politically, but also economically and in trade. This, of course, makes some people not happy. They see that Africa as their monopoly, so it's not up to other people to be there. But anyway, that will not block Chinese relationship, friendship between China and Africa. There are some things raised by these people. They are showing concern about working conditions, about environmental protection, about human rights. To some extent, they are right. Of course, the open policy of China means we open to the outside world. We open to the outside world means we learn from the outside world. All these international standards in the last 3 decades played a very important role in the progress of China itself. When we start our open policy, when we start to open to the Western investment into China, I've been to some of the factories myself. The working conditions there was really, really questionable. Because I myself spent 5 years in a village during the Cultural Revolution. I have a very close link with all these peasants, and then peasants become migrant workers myself. So I see the change. I see first the change, we move these peasants from the field into a workshop. Though the conditions is not ideal, compared with the Western countries, far behind. But even for that kind of workshop, themselves is improving a lot, the condition. I see that as a result, certainly a result of the Chinese government, the result of Chinese workers demanding, but of course, the investors, the Western NGOs also play a positive part of that. We welcome that, we're happy. But sometimes we will also be very careful is that if certain people want to use that as a weapon or as a tool for trade protectionism, that is wrong. That's not only damage the trade between China and other countries, but sometimes also damage their own interest. So we would like to sit down and talk to them fairly and open our mind and also listen to their ideas. Whenever people bring us suggestions and sometimes even criticism in a very sincere way, we're happy. We work together with them. That's our attitude. And that kind of attitude actually benefited us a lot in the last 30 years, and we are still going to do that. That's our attitude. Thank you.
Mr. Piqué, you want to respond to that?
Bueno, no tanto contestar a eso, ¿no? Pero sí hacer algunos comentarios al hilo de lo que se ha dicho. Muchas veces desde el mundo que hasta ahora llamábamos desarrollado, es decir, desde Occidente, se nos dice, por parte de los agentes económicos occidentales, se nos dice, bueno, esto del libre comercio está muy bien, pero hay situaciones que podríamos denominar de dumping ecológico, o hay situaciones de denominado dumping social, porque tenemos que competir con otras empresas y otros países que tienen unas exigencias medioambientales y unas exigencias sociolaborales mucho más laxas, mucho más débiles que las nuestras. Por lo tanto, estamos compitiendo no en igualdad de condiciones. A mí me gusta mucho cuando me comentan eso recordar a Dickens, porque cuando se desarrolla el capitalismo en el Reino Unido, cuando se hace la revolución industrial, las condiciones sociolaborales eran las que eran y había muchísimo trabajo infantil, muchísimas horas por encima de lo que sería razonable y desde luego ningún respeto para el medio ambiente. Yo no digo que tengamos que defender que determinados países no tengan que cuidar el medio ambiente ni tengan que tener atención de sus condiciones sociolaborales, no digo eso, pero digo que también tiene un punto de injusticia que les exijamos a los demás lo que nosotros no hicimos cuando nos desarrollamos económicamente, cuando nos industrializamos. Y eso liga con la presencia de China en África. Yo sé muy bien el criticismo, las críticas que despierta la presencia africana, la presencia china en África o en América Latina. Y es verdad que muchas veces esa presencia puede ser criticable. Por ejemplo, determinados programas de construcción de vivienda social, que es muy necesaria en muchos países africanos, se desarrollan con financiación y con inversión china, pero con mano de obra china, en condiciones muchas veces pues como mínimo criticables, ¿no? Pero dicho esto, yo comparto plenamente con nuestro colega, ¿no?, lo que ha dicho. Esto de invertir en determinados países para obtener ventajas competitivas y aprovisionarse de materias primas, desde luego no lo ha inventado China. Eso lo hemos hecho los demás durante siglos. Y además lo hemos hecho probablemente con menos contrapartidas para los países afectados que lo que ahora hace China. Porque si yo entiendo bien la ecuación de canje, China lo que hace es financiar y construir infraestructuras de transporte, de comunicación, de vivienda, a cambio de contrapartidas económicas. Me parece mucho más fair que simplemente llevarse las materias primas y no hacer nada. Y por lo tanto yo creo que un cierto punto de autocrítica por parte de Occidente, cuando criticamos con razón algunos aspectos negativos de la presencia china en África, también deberíamos hacerlo, porque hay que ser siempre conscientes de la historia, de la propia historia que todos tenemos.
Mr. Helal, the roots of the last 2 years' uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East were obviously economic as much as they were political. I'm wondering how will the transitions that we're seeing in the region, in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, how will this change these regimes' conversations about trade? Do you think that these new governments, these new more democratic governments, will approach international trade in a different way than their predecessors?
Like I said earlier, be it in particularly more about Egypt, because obviously I'm more familiar with it. The raison d'etre of the events of January 25th, the uprising that happened, were essentially economic. The slogan of the revolution in Egypt was freedom, bread, and social justice. If you look at them, they're all one. You cannot be free, really, if you're not secure in your daily bread. And you cannot have social justice if there is no economic prosperity for the whole society. So I have always posited that the reason for the revolution was mainly economic hardship. And therefore, the solution can only be, or largely be, in economic well-being. The problem with Egypt, and I suspect our neighboring countries, although Egypt being the most populous Arab country is very paramount, it is what I call the time bomb. The time bomb is the unemployment in the youth. Egypt's demographics is a very young nation, but 50% of our population is under the age of 23 or 22. That in itself can go either way. It can produce a tremendous burst of positive energy, absolutely incredible for the well-being of the economy and the society, and equally it can unleash untold destructive powers. How? It's very simple. The youth have aspirations, legitimate ones. they have hopes, they have dreams. They want to work, they want to create a decent life for themselves, they want to get married, have children, have dignified lives, schools, etc., etc. Now, all this cannot happen if there is no economic growth that can provide such opportunities. And opportunities, I do not mean public service. I do not mean creating more government employees, as seems to be the trick for some governments. It's just create more government jobs, satisfy the people. It doesn't work. What you need is to fuel the economy. What you need is to rekindle the spirit of enterprise. What you need is invest heavily in education. These things can then provide the platform that will enable the country to expand its trade. And as I said earlier, trade is always the catalyst for investment. Create the jobs, create the productive jobs that then will lead to economic prosperity, social justice, and then freedom. So the short answer is I do not think that any government with one grain of common sense can do anything but encourage market economy with social justice for sure, cannot do anything but encourage private sector, cannot do anything but encourage trade and encourage investments, because without that, I'm afraid the alternative is simply unthinkable. And what we have seen in the Arab Spring, so-called the Arab Spring, is a sample. If we don't get it right, the real product will be much, much worse. I would not even dare to think about it.
So I want to conclude just by asking one more question to our entire panel, and we'll start with Mr. Safadi this time and work this way. You know, if you could suggest one step that international policymakers could take right now to make trade more equitable, both for least developed, fast developing, and of course developed countries, what do you think that first step should be? And Mr. Safadi, I believe you also wanted to respond to the last point. And if we could please, we're running out of time, so if we could keep these to 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, let me first respond to the last intervention, which was very interesting. I mean, if you, in a pre-Arab Spring environment here, the economic situation in the Arab world, in all these Arab Spring countries, was actually a mirror image of the political system. Highly dirigist, redistributive, autocratic, where the role of the market was usurped by, you know, the very few. So basically they were rentier economies. Rentier economies, and by definition, even growth was taking place, you know, some positive growth. In the case of Egypt, it was between 4 to 6% invariably. In the course of the same numbers for Tunisia, Libya the same, even a bit higher, Syria in the same realm, although they went through troughs, and they weathered actually the economic crisis, the 2008 and 9 economic crisis very well. But the system was a rentier system that actually paralleled, mimicked a mirror image of the political system that was there. And therefore, income disparities were widened throughout. The very few captured, even the fewer benefits that were being had from whatever cosmetic attempts at reform that were taking place, be they in the terms of privatization, be they in terms of liberalization, deregulation, and integration in the global economy. So these words now in the post-Arab Spring countries have taken on a bad feeling, a bad connotation, because they were tried in the pre-Arab Spring, but they were tried but at the same time captured by the very few. Whatever attempts, or what I just termed as cosmetic attempts at reform that we've had in the region, were actually being captured by the very few, and here we have a situation of high unemployment, added to it underemployment, meaning people, you know, who are engineers are driving taxis or doing something else. And of course, the youth bulge and the youth unemployment problem. So moving forward, what we need a rethink of the role of government itself in the market economy. Again, I started by saying we need more trade rather than less trade. And here I'm going to say I need less government, not more government in the marketplace. We need to redefine the role of government in terms of creating a level playing field across the region so that entrepreneurs and business can go and doing what it does best. Government regulates, that's what it should do best, rather than create, gives incentives and capture segments of business. Now, what can the developed world do? Not only to actually promote freer trade and the development or the inclusive growth of the Arab countries. First thing first, do no more harm. And that means no protectionist policies, be they in the trade or investment. No more of that. Right? So that is the first. I know it's a negative connotation, do no more harm rather than do good, but it actually carries a big weight in the sense that we need today, as I started by saying, more trade and more investment, and we need to find every single opportunity to move it forward, move the agenda forward. Now, we have before us an agenda, an agreement, or a blueprints of an agreement on trade facilitation that promises great returns at very low costs to all the participants, and I'm making a plea here to actually try and move forward at a multilateral agreement on trade facilitation. So I'm not calling it a low-hanging fruit or whatever, but it's a fruit. Let's have it. Let's avail ourselves of it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Piqué.
Sí, muchas gracias. La pregunta era qué podemos hacer para incrementar el comercio, ¿no? Y yo creo que la respuesta, de alguna manera, se acaba de mencionar, ¿no? Libertad, que funcionen los mecanismos de mercado y que al mismo tiempo avancemos en la creciente institucionalización de las reglas del juego para que los mecanismos de mercado funcionen correctamente. Para que la libertad se pueda ejercitar en términos fair, ¿no? En términos de lealtad recíproca. Y eso es lo que yo creo que equipara al final un poco la pregunta que se nos planteaba, ¿no? Free trade o fair trade. Solo lo fair es free, si es free, y tiene que ser free para que sea fair, ¿no? Y lo que necesitamos es que por la vía multilateral o por la vía bilateral, y cuando hablo de bilateral pues son grandes acuerdos, hay un acuerdo entre la Unión Europea y China que está funcionando razonablemente bien, hay otro entre la Unión Europea y Corea del Sur, la República de Corea, que está funcionando razonablemente bien. Curiosamente, no hemos sido capaces de llegar a un acuerdo entre la Unión Europea y Japón todavía, a pesar de ser países del mundo occidental. Bueno, iremos avanzando, ¿no? Pero yo creo que la mejor manera de incrementar el comercio es el libre cambio, reglas del juego compartidas, que además, yo veo que me estoy quedando solo en esta mesa insistiendo en este punto, ¿no? También quiere decir reglas de juego compartidas en los tipos de cambio, porque me parece que es un elemento muy importante. Y si se me permite un brevísimo comentario respecto a lo que está sucediendo en los países árabes y que fue recibido por parte de todos nosotros con enormes...
I'm sorry, we're running short on time. I just want to move it along. I apologize.
Well, I won't take long. The only thing I can say, and everything else has been largely covered by my colleagues, but I would just like to add from the perspective of countries like Egypt and other Arab countries in the emerging markets, it is not only trade that will make the difference for us. We certainly need facilitation of trade, but we equally need more investments. That is crucial. And this is where China, for example, is highly appreciated in our part of the world, contrary to what criticism you might hear about this and that. But they were there when nobody else was, and this is what we would like to see.
Thank you, Mr. Zhong. If you want to conclude.
Thank you very much. I will just also add a little bit about Africa. According to statistics, in the foreign trade of this continent, only 11 to 12% of the foreign trade is inside this continent. That means African to African trade compose very small part of their trade. This is a pity. I think it's not healthy for them, because they all send their goods out to some other part of the world and then buy back by the neighboring country. So we think this is a great potential. If we can raise the percentage of the trade within the continent itself, will bring a lot of benefit to the people. One of the problems they are facing to solve this is lack of infrastructure. That's why we are very happy to participate. And also we are good at that. The successful story of Chinese development to prove to people infrastructure is always the first one, the first important thing. And we are happy to do that. That's my suggestion and understanding. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for staying around for this great discussion. It's a lot more we could say, but I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all.